In this video, Magnus Carlsen checkmates Alireza Firouzja in the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. Now in the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4, best by test. Alireza goes 1c5 to Sicilian Defense. This is the most combative option to 1e4 by Magnus. And now here, knight to f3, d6. And here, instead of d4 heading for the open Sicilian, Magnus Carlsen does go for the move bishop c4, a very popular anti-Sicilian line. Now from here, Alireza, knight to f6 on the board, challenging the pawn on e4. Magnus defends with the move d3, and then e6, a very simple developing move by Alireza, setting up bishop e7, short castles, and blunting the bishop on this diagonal here. Now from here, Magnus, he simply castles, then knight c6 for Alireza, and then rook to e1 for Magnus. Now here, bishop e7 on the board, setting up short castles. Magnus goes bishop b3, a very simple move getting out of the way of a future d5 advance from Alireza. And now castles, c3, and here Alireza, the strongest move is going to be b5, expanding on the queenside, but instead he goes a6, setting up b5, but this move is a little bit slower. Now here Magnus, he goes d4, breaking in the center, a very typical idea in these Italian-style positions. And now Alireza, again, b5 is going to be the strongest move, but instead here he breaks in the center in the spirit of the French defense with the move d5. Now here Magnus is a very big choice. He can take on d5, or he can go for the stronger option, which he did in the game, e5, advancing the e-pawn and keeping the center closed with this sort of French defense structure in the middle of the board. Now the knight is being attacked. Where does the knight go? Obviously, knight h5 is not good. It loses the knight to the move g4, and the knight has nowhere to go. So, knight d7 and knight to e4 are the main options, and in the game, as usual, Alireza does go for the more aggressive option, knight to e4 on the board. Now Magnus Carlsen, he simply goes knight d2, challenging the knight on e4, and now the threat is knight takes and then rook takes, winning a pawn. So Alireza is forced to go knight takes d2 in this position, or something like f5 trying to defend the knight, but instead knight takes d2 on the board in the game. Now Magnus, bishop takes d2, wins back the knight, and then here Alireza, he decides to fix the pawn structure in the center with move c takes d4 and then c takes back from Magnus. And now we officially have a French defense structure in the middle of the board, and White's plan here is going to be attacking on the Kingside, perhaps setting up a battery with queen c2 and a future queen d3, setting up threats on the h7 square. And meanwhile, Alireza is going to have to counterattack on the queenside or try to get some sort of counterplay going on the kingside with the move f6 or f5. So let's see how these plans play out in the game. Here, Alireza, bishop d7, a very simple developing move, the idea being setting up rook to c8, and the rook will be active on the c-file here. Now Magnus, bishop c2, and then rook to c8 for Alireza on the board. Instead of this, the main idea in this position would have been either f6 or f5, and it's really important for Alireza to get counterplay going on the king side immediately, but instead rook c8 on the board for Alireza. Now g3 for Magnus, the idea being setting up h4 threats in the future, and that h-pawn could potentially be a battering ram, and beyond that, it could also set up various knight to g5 ideas. Now here, again, f6 and f5 are the key moves for Alireza, but instead knight to a5 on the board. The idea being he wants to jump into that c4 square with the knight, and from there it will be forking the pawn on b2 and the bishop on d2, forcing something like bishop c1 on the board trying to defend. But here, Magnus, he is not concerned. He just continues with the attack, h4 on the board, and now again, he is threatening ideas like knight to g5, trying to overload that pawn on the h7 square. Now here, Alireza, he continues his idea, knight to c4 on the board, forking both the bishop on d2 and that pawn on b2. Now Magnus, bishop c1, gets the bishop out of the attack. He wants to maintain that bishop pair in this game, and beyond that, he also defends the pawn on b2 with the bishop. Now, the drawback of this move is the rook on the a1 square is currently locked in. However, this move bishop d2 also opens up the idea of queen d3, threatening checkmate on h7, and that is going to be Magnus Carlsen's main attacking idea in this position. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, as usual, his best ideas are going to include f6 and f5, trying to open up the f-file for the rook and try to relieve some of the pressure on the king side. But instead here, he counterattacks on the queen side with the move queen to b6, trying to overload the pawn on b2 with the queen and the knight on c4. Now here, what does Magnus Carlsen do in this position? Well, he has two main ideas. First of all, you can defend the pawn on b3 immediately. That is what Magnus does in the game. However, instead, there is the second option of simply queen d3 immediately, threatening checkmate on h7. That would have been perhaps the strongest idea. Instead here, Magnus rook b1 on the board, just defending b2 with the rook and the bishop. Magnus playing very safe and solid so far in this game. Now here, Alireza, once again, I'm going to be a broken record, but f6 and f5 are the key ideas. Instead, he plays a very big weakening move on the king side, h6. And this move is really the start of all of Alireza's problems in this game. Here, Magnus, he plays the very obvious move, queen d3, threatening checkmate on h7 in one move. Of course, Alireza is going to have to defend, but now the move like g6, for example, is no good because that hangs the pawn on h6 to the bishop. So instead here, Alireza is forced to go f5, but now after e takes f6, this pawn move h6 does weaken the light squares on the king side, and that is going to be a huge problem for Alireza in the rest of this game. Now here, of course, the bishop on e7 is being attacked. Alireza takes back with the bishop. Bishop takes f6 on the board, but now queen to h7 for Magnus Carlsen, hitting the king on g8 and forcing out king to f7 for Alireza. Now here, Magnus, he spots a very simple tactic. That pawn on g7 is pinned to the king by the queen. Therefore, the move is going to be bishop takes h6, winning a free pawn, as g takes h6 is not a possibility in this position. Now here, Magnus Carlsen has a raging attack against Alireza Firouzja's king, and what should he be doing to try and defend? Well, it turns out the best defensive setup, and it's not pretty, you have to go rook to h8, forcing queen g6, and then king to g8. However, with that setup, your king is blocking in the rook on the h8 square forever. It's not pretty, but it is the best setup. Instead here, Alireza takes on d4 with the bishop. Bishop takes d4, a very active move. The idea being you are threatening bishop takes f2, hitting the king and the rook on the e1 square. However, Magnus, he just steps out of the attack with the very simple move, king to g2, getting rid of that potential fork on the king and the rook on the f2 square. Now, king d2 is not the best move per se, but it is good enough in this position. And now again, rook to h8 is the best move here for Alireza. The same idea we saw before, rook h8, queen g6, then king to g8, trying to defend. But instead here, bishop f6 on the board. Alireza just retreats the bishop, but this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Here, Magnus, he goes b3, knocking back the knight. The knight goes to a3, and then Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the bishop to the g6 square. Bishop g6 on the board, hitting the king and forcing the king to go back to the e7 square. So, king to e7 is forced here, but then bishop takes g7 wins the pawn, and now the threat is simply bishop takes f6 with a discovered attack on the king with the queen. So, with that being said, bishop takes g7 is the best move by Alireza. That is what's played in the game, but now queen takes g7 hits the king, and once again the king has to go somewhere. Now, if you go king d8 here, then the rook on the f8 square will fall. Therefore, the move king to d6 is virtually forced. But now, queen to e5 by Magnus hits the king again. Where is Alireza going to go? Well, in the game, he goes king to e7. That is the best move. Instead, if you go here king to c7, then rook e to c1 hits the king, and things get very ugly very fast. So, instead, king to e7 on the board, but now the king is trapped in the middle of the board. That is definitely not a good thing. Now here, Magnus, queen g7, repeating moves, king d6, and then rook b to d1, an excellent move, lining up both of the rooks on the d and the e file, setting up various threats against the black king. Now here, Alireza, knight to c2, threatening the rook on the e1 square, and of course the knight is being defended by the rook, so bishop takes c2 is not a very big threat here by Magnus. Now of course Magnus spots the threat, his rook is being attacked on e1, he just goes rook to e2, knocking back the knight goes to b4 where it is better defended, and now queen to e5 once again hits the king. Now king to e7, again king to c6 is not a good move, rook d to c1 is very, very strong, therefore king to e7 on the board, but now a3 knocks back the knight to c6, and here Magnus again spots a very simple tactic. Queen takes d5 on the board, and of course the pawn on the e6 square is pinned by the rook to the king on e7. And man, this attack is getting scarier and scarier for Magnus. Alright, here, Alireza, he tries to defend, rook c d8 on the board, stopping the threat of simply queen takes d7, winning the game on the spot. But now Magnus, queen g5 hits the king, the rook blocks, rook to f6, but now the rook on f6 is pinned by the queen to the king, and all the rest of the pieces here are getting more and more tangled up. Alright, bishop e4 for Magnus, rerouting the bishop and putting pressure on that knight on c6. Now rook to f8 defends the rook, but then b4 gains space on the queen side. Magnus so far is not in a rush. He knows he has this game won, one way or another. Now here, bishop e8 on the board for Alireza, h5 for Magnus, A very strong idea, potentially setting up a threat of h6, h7, and h8 trying to promote to a queen. Now here, Alireza, knight to d8, trying to set up some sort of fortress, trying to further defend that pawn on the e6 square, but Magnus Carlsen, he is not amused. He jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, knight to e5 on the board, and in certain lines, he may be threatening knight to g6. And now here in this position, Alireza Firouzja makes the biggest blunder of the game. He goes knight to f7. And here, you don't have to be a very stable chess genius like Magnus Carlsen to spot the finishing blow in this game. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he delivers the checkmate with the knight with an absolutely beautiful move. Knight to g6. This is checkmate as the rook on the f6 square is pinned to the king. Rook takes g6 is not a possibility, and the king has nowhere to go because the rook on d1 cuts off all the squares on the d file. Wow, what a finishing blow by Magnus Carlsen versus Alireza Firouzja in this game. Okay, Chess YouTube, please smash that YouTube like button. It helps me out so much. And while you're at it, check out this video right here where Alireza Firouzja busts out the Alekhines opening against Magnus Carlsen. That game was insane. I'm sure you're going to love it. And I'll see you in the next video.